On October 20, 1944, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Zuikaku and gave an order that no naval commander should ever have to give. He told his staff to sail his fleet directly into the path of the most powerful naval force ever assembled. His 4 aircraft carriers carried barely 100 aircraft between them. The American Third Fleet waiting to the south possessed over 1,000. Ozawa knew exactly what would happen. He was volunteering his men to die. 700 miles to the southwest, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the real striking power of the Imperial Japanese Navy. His center force included the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever built, armed with 18-inch guns that could hurl shells weighing as much as a small automobile. These monsters displaced over 70,000 tons each. A single broadside from Yamato weighed nearly 15 tons. If Kurita could reach the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf, he could slaughter the transports and change the course of the Pacific War. But Kurita would never get there unless someone drew away the American carriers. The American Third Fleet under Admiral William Halsey possessed overwhelming power: 6 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, 6 fast battleships, over 80 cruisers and destroyers, more than 1,000 aircraft. If Halsey stood guard over San Bernardino Strait, Kurita's battleships would sail into a wall of bombs and torpedoes. Someone had to lure Halsey away. Someone had to die so that others might have a chance to fight. Ozawa raised his hand. He would be the bait. The man who volunteered for this suicide mission was no ordinary officer. Jisaburo Ozawa was born on October 2, 1886, in Koyu County, Miyazaki Prefecture, on the southern island of Kyushu. He stood notably tall, well over 6 feet, a physical giant among his countrymen at a time when the average Japanese man barely reached 5 feet 4. His harsh, angular features earned him the nickname Onigawara, meaning the gargoyle, after the fearsome demon tiles that guard Japanese temple roofs. Fellow officers sometimes remarked that he was among the 3 ugliest admirals in the Imperial Navy. He did not seem to mind. His appearance mattered less to him than his ideas. Ozawa graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy on November 19, 1909, ranking 45th out of 179 students in the 37th class. He specialized initially in torpedo warfare, the queen of naval combat in the age before aviation. But as aircraft proved their worth in the 1920s and 30s, Ozawa recognized that the future belonged to the carriers. What distinguished Ozawa from his peers was his willingness to think beyond tradition. He was among the first senior officers in the Imperial Navy to recognize that aircraft carriers should not be scattered among different fleet formations, but concentrated into a single devastating striking force. In the late 1930s, he worked with Commander Minoru Genda and Rear Admiral Takejiro Onishi to convince Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto that Japan should consolidate its carriers into one unit. This concept was revolutionary. Traditional naval doctrine treated carriers as scouts and support vessels for the battle line. Ozawa and his colleagues argued that carriers should be the battle line. Massed together, their aircraft could deliver a knockout blow before enemy battleships ever came within gun range. Yamamoto listened. The concept led directly to the creation of the First Air Fleet in April 1941. That force, known as the Kido Butai, the Mobile Force, would attack Pearl Harbor 8 months later with 6 carriers sailing in tight formation, launching aircraft in coordinated waves that devastated the American Pacific Fleet. Yamamoto reportedly wanted Ozawa to command the Kido Butai, but the rigid seniority system of the Imperial Navy prevented it. The position went instead to Vice Admiral Triichi Nagumo, a battleship admiral with limited understanding of carrier aviation. Ozawa was assigned to lead the Southern Expeditionary Fleet during the invasion of Malaya in December 1941. He performed brilliantly in this secondary role. While Nagumo's carriers attacked Pearl Harbor, Ozawa executed complex amphibious operations to put Japanese troops ashore in Thailand and Malaya. British Force Zede, the battleship Prince of Wales, and battlecruiser Repulse hunted his vulnerable transports. Ozawa evaded them skillfully, and land-based Japanese aircraft found and sank both British capital ships before they could interfere with his landings. In April 1942, Ozawa led a raiding force built around the light carrier Rujo into the Indian Ocean. His task was to disrupt British shipping and demonstrate Japanese naval power in waters far from the Pacific. In just 3 days, his aircraft and cruisers sank 23 merchant ships, totaling approximately 112,000 to 130,000 gross tons. The British Eastern Fleet fled to East Africa rather than face him. Ozawa returned to Singapore in triumph. But the war was already turning. On June 4, 1942, American dive bombers caught 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, with their flight decks packed with armed and fueled aircraft. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were flaming wrecks. The Kido Butai that Ozawa had helped create was gutted in a single morning. Nagumo survived Midway, but his reputation did not. On November 11, 1942, Ozawa finally received the command he had long deserved. He replaced Nagumo as commander of the Third Fleet, Japan's carrier task force. The man who had conceived the concentrated carrier force would now lead what remained of it. By March 1944, Ozawa had risen to command the first mobile fleet, consolidating all remaining Japanese carrier forces under his flag. His flagship was Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier. Taiho represented the pinnacle of Japanese carrier design, an armored giant displacing nearly 30,000 tons standard, her flight deck protected by steel plate that could shrug off bomb hits that would cripple her older vessels. Ozawa finally had the tools he needed for the decisive battle. Japanese naval doctrine had always envisioned one great clash between the battle fleets, a modern Tsushima that would determine mastery of the Pacific. As American forces advanced through the Central Pacific toward the Mariana Islands in the spring of 1944, Ozawa prepared to deliver that decisive blow. His carriers had been rebuilt since Midway, his air groups had been retrained. The moment for Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet battle, had arrived. The Battle of the Philippine Sea unfolded on June 19 and 20, 1944, in the waters west of Saipan. It was supposed to be Japan's moment of redemption. It became instead the death of Japanese naval aviation. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aircraft fell from the sky in numbers that defied belief. Ozawa launched 430 aircraft in 4 massive strikes against the American fleet. Barely 100 returned. The slaughter was not close combat between equals, it was systematic annihilation. American Hellcat fighters, flown by pilots with 2 years of training and over 300 flight hours, tore through Japanese formations with brutal efficiency. The Japanese aviators had been rushed through abbreviated programs lasting only 2 to 6 months. Some had barely 100 hours of total flight time. They flew outdated Zero variants against pilots who had studied their tactics and knew their weaknesses. American radar detected the Japanese strikes while they were still 100 miles out. Fighter directors vectored Hellcats into perfect intercept positions. The Japanese pilots, many flying their first combat mission, found themselves surrounded by enemies who knew exactly where they would be. The numbers told the story of annihilation. Japan lost between 476 and 600 aircraft. depending on whether land-based losses from Guam and Rota were included. Hundreds of trained aviators died, including irreplaceable squadron leaders and senior pilots who had been flying combat missions since the opening days of the war. These men represented years of investment in training, years of accumulated experience. They could not be replaced. Japan's naval aviation training program had already collapsed under the weight of fuel shortages and accumulated losses. There were no reserves waiting to fill the empty cockpits. Worse still, American submarines found Ozawa's carriers. The submarine Albacore, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard, crept through the Japanese destroyer screen and put a torpedo into Taiho at 8:10 in the morning on June 19. The damage seemed minor at first. Taiho continued flight operations, but damage control teams made a fatal error. Attempting to clear aviation fuel vapors from the hangar deck, they switched on ventilation fans that spread the fumes throughout the ship. 6 hours later, a spark found the vapor cloud. Taiho exploded and broke apart, taking over 1,000 men with her. That same morning, the submarine Kavala, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Herman Kostler, torpedoed the carrier Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, the Coral Sea, and a dozen other battles. 3 torpedoes struck her hull. Fires spread to her aviation fuel storage. She too exploded and sank, adding another 1,272 men to the day's toll. Ozawa escaped the disaster aboard the destroyer Wakatsuki after Taiho went down. When his staff tallied the surviving aircraft, a dejected officer recorded in his log that only 35 operational planes remained across all his carriers. Ozawa had sorted with over 400 aircraft. He had lost 90% of his strength in 2 days. He submitted his resignation to Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. Toyoda refused to accept it. Japan could not afford to lose one of its most capable admirals, even one who had presided over such a catastrophe. But Ozawa understood something that the formal rejection could not change. His carriers were finished as offensive weapons. Without trained pilots, they were nothing more than floating targets waiting to be sunk. The force he had spent his career building, the concentrated carrier striking power that had humbled the British and Americans in 1941 and 42, existed now only as a memory. 4 months later, that grim reality would become the foundation of his final mission. By October 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond anything Japanese planners had imagined possible. American submarines prowled the shipping lanes between the home islands and the southern resource area, sinking tankers and freighters with devastating efficiency. Oil imports had collapsed catastrophically over the previous year. The lifeblood of the Imperial Navy was draining away. The combined fleet could no longer base in home waters. There was not enough fuel. Admiral Toyoda had been forced to split his forces, keeping the carriers in the inland sea near Japan where they could train replacement pilots, while sending the battleships and cruisers to Linga Roads near Singapore to be close to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. This dispersal meant that any major operation would require the scattered forces to converge from widely separated starting points, a coordination nightmare. The Philippine Islands sat directly across the shipping lanes connecting Japan to Southeast Asia. Every barrel of oil, every ton of rubber, every shipment of rice and tin had to pass through Philippine waters. If the Americans seized the Philippines, they would sever the jugular of the Japanese Empire. Admiral Toyoda understood this brutal calculus. In his post-war interrogation, he explained the impossible choice facing the combined fleet. Should we lose in the Philippines operations even though the fleet should be left, the shipping lane to the south would be completely cut off so that the fleet, if it should come back to Japanese waters, could not obtain its fuel supply. If it should remain in southern waters, it could not receive supplies of ammunition and arms. There would be no sense in saving the fleet at the expense of the loss of the Philippines. The logic was inescapable. The fleet had to fight at the Philippines. If it lost, Japan lost everything. But if it did not fight, if it allowed the Americans to seize the islands without challenge, Japan lost everything anyway. The only question was whether to die fighting or die slowly. Toyoda chose to fight. The plan that emerged was designated Sho Go One, the victory operation for the defense of the Philippines. The Naval General Staff informed Toyoda on July 26, 1944, that the operation would use the code name Sho, meaning to conquer. Planning continued through August, and by autumn the design was complete. Sho Go One called for every remaining major warship of the Imperial Japanese Navy to converge on the American invasion fleet in a coordinated attack from multiple directions. The complexity was staggering. Forces would sortie from Japan, from Brunei, from the Lingga anchorage. They would transit through treacherous straits, past American submarine patrols and air bases, arriving at Leyte Gulf simultaneously to catch the invasion fleet in a deadly vice. The plan divided Japanese forces into 4 groups, each with a specific mission. The center force under Vice Admiral Kurita would carry the main striking power of the operation. Kurita commanded the super battleships Yamato and Musashi with their 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a ship. He had the battleship Nagato, veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack, and the fast battleships Kongo and Haruna. Supporting them were 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers. This armada would transit the Sibuyan Sea in the central Philippines, pass through San Bernardino Strait, north of Leyte, and fall upon the American transports at dawn on October 25. The southern force under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would create a pincer from the south. His 2 old battleships, Fuso and Yamashiro, veterans of World War I, modernized for the current conflict, would push through Surigao Strait south of Leyte, along with the heavy cruiser Mogami and 4 destroyers. Nishimura was expected to draw American attention to the southern approach, while Kurita delivered the killing blow from the north. A second striking force under Vice Admiral Kiyohide would follow Nishimura through Surigao Strait with 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 4 destroyers, adding weight to the southern thrust. And then there was the northern force, Ozawa's carriers. Everyone involved in planning understood what the northern force was meant to do. Japan no longer had the pilots to conduct effective carrier strikes. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had slaughtered most of the trained aviators. The Battle off Formosa from October 12 to 16, just days before the Philippines operation began, had killed most of the rest. The Formosa air battle had been a catastrophe, piled upon catastrophe. When American carriers raided Formosa, Japanese commanders threw everything they had at the attackers. 600 aircraft rose to challenge the Americans. Almost none returned. The pilots Japan had carefully hoarded for the decisive battle were consumed in a sideshow. When Ozawa's carriers prepared to sortie for Sho Go One, their air groups existed only on paper. Ozawa's 4 carriers could muster barely 100 aircraft between them, many flown by pilots who had completed only the most rudimentary training. These aviators could take off and land. Some could navigate. Few had any experience in combat tactics, formation flying, or coordinated strikes. Against American pilots with hundreds of combat hours, they were dead men flying. These carriers could not fight the American fleet, but they could die in front of it. Ozawa volunteered his ships as sacrificial bait. His carriers would sail south from Japan, deliberately exposing themselves to American reconnaissance. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, was known for his aggressive temperament. When Halsey spotted Japanese carriers, he would be unable to resist the opportunity to destroy them. Fleet carriers represented the decisive targets that American naval doctrine demanded he prioritize. If Ozawa could draw Halsey north, away from San Bernardino Strait, Kurita's battleships would have a clear path to the American invasion beaches. The transports gathered in Leyte Gulf were fat targets, thin-skinned vessels loaded with troops and supplies. Kurita's 18-inch shells would tear through them like tissue paper. The northern force departed Japan through Bungo Strait at 1800 hours on the evening of October 20, 1944. They passed between the home islands and into the Philippine Sea, sailing south toward their appointment with destruction. The composition of this sacrificial fleet reflected how thoroughly Japan's carrier power had been gutted. The flagship Zuikaku displaced 25,675 tons and had once carried over 80 aircraft. She now had perhaps 65, many of them flown by men who barely qualified as pilots. The light carrier Zuiho displaced 11,443 tons and carried about 29 planes. The converted light carriers Chitose and Chiyoda, each roughly 11,000 tons, carried barely a handful of aircraft between them. Most pathetic of all were the hybrid battleship carriers Issei and Hyuga. These World War I-era dreadnoughts had been partially converted with flight decks replacing their rear turrets. They were designed to carry 22 float planes each, aircraft that could provide scouting and limited strike capability. But their air group, the 634th Naval Air Group, had been sent to Formosa and annihilated in the futile battles before Sho Go One began. Issei and Hyuga sailed toward battle carrying no aircraft at all. They were battleships without full armament and carriers without planes, neither one thing nor the other, useful only as targets. Supporting this force were the light cruisers Oyodo, Tama, and Isuzu, plus 9 destroyers, including the powerful Akazuki-class anti-aircraft ships Akazuki and Hatsuzuki. In total, Ozawa commanded 17 warships against Halsey's armada of over 65 vessels. The disparity in aircraft was even more grotesque. Ozawa had roughly 100 planes. Halsey had over 1,000. Ozawa later admitted his doubts about the mission. In his post-war interrogation, he said simply, "I had not much confidence in being a lure, but there was no other way than to try." Among his ships, one held special significance beyond her role as flagship. Zuikaku was the last survivor of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Her sister ship Shokaku had been torpedoed at the Philippine Sea just 4 months earlier. The 4 carriers lost at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had all preceded her to the bottom. Zuikaku alone remained, the final link to the glory days when Japanese carriers swept all before them. She had launched planes against Pearl Harbor, against Ceylon, against the Coral Sea, against Santa Cruz, against the Philippine Sea. Now she was sailing south, not to victory but to deliberate destruction, carrying with her the last remnant of the Kido Butai's legacy. The greatest irony of Ozawa's mission was that he struggled to be noticed. His entire purpose was to attract American attention and draw the Third Fleet north. Yet for critical hours on October 24, the Americans could not find him. Ozawa deliberately broke radio silence multiple times, flooding the airwaves with transmissions designed to be intercepted by American signals intelligence. He wanted the Americans to know exactly where he was, but his radio equipment was malfunctioning. The signals were not getting through. Neither the Americans nor his fellow Japanese commanders could hear him. Kurita, pushing through the Sibuyan Sea to the south, while American aircraft pounded his ships, received no confirmation that the decoy was in position. On the morning of October 24, Ozawa launched 76 aircraft, virtually his entire offensive capability, in a strike against the American carriers reported to the south. He did not expect these planes to accomplish much militarily. Most were flown by pilots barely qualified to take off and land. The strike would probably achieve nothing in terms of damage inflicted, but it would serve its true purpose. American combat air patrols would intercept the Japanese aircraft. Even if the Japanese pilots were shot down, the very fact of their attack would reveal the presence of Japanese carriers to the north. It would attract attention. The attack unfolded exactly as Ozawa expected. American Hellcats found the Japanese formation and began the systematic slaughter. Most of the Japanese aircraft were shot down without ever sighting an American ship. The survivors were ordered not to return to the carriers. They would land at airfields in the Philippines instead. Ozawa had just given away his air groups permanently. His carriers were now completely defenseless. When a cruiser in his force reported being strafed by an American scout plane, Ozawa felt genuine relief. At last, someone had found them. He immediately transmitted a message to Combined Fleet Headquarters, to Kurita, and to all other commands announcing that the Americans had spotted his force and were taking the bait. That message also failed to transmit properly. The malfunctioning radios betrayed him again. Kurita never received confirmation that the decoy was working. American reconnaissance finally located the northern force at 4:40 in the afternoon on October 24. A scout plane from the carrier Lexington spotted Ozawa's ships 190 miles northeast of Cape Engano, the northeastern tip of Luzon Island. The Spanish name of that cape means deception. The irony was perfect. Admiral Halsey received the sighting report with satisfaction. His pilots had been pounding Kurita's center force all day in the Sibuyan Sea. The super battleship Musashi had finally rolled over and sunk after absorbing an estimated 17 to 19 torpedoes and numerous bombs. Kurita appeared to be retreating westward. The southern force under Nishimura was heading for Surigao Strait, where Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet waited in ambush. And now fresh, apparently undamaged carriers had appeared to the north. To Halsey, this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Japanese carriers had been the decisive weapon of the Pacific War since Pearl Harbor. Destroy them, and the naval threat to American operations would end forever. Halsey's orders from Admiral Chester Nimitz were unambiguous on this point. If opportunity for destruction of major portion of the enemy fleet offer or can be created, such destruction becomes the primary task. The carriers were that opportunity. Everything else was secondary. At approximately 7:50 in the evening, Halsey made the decision that would haunt his reputation for the rest of his life. He ordered his entire 3rd Fleet, all 6 fast battleships, all 12 carriers, every cruiser and destroyer under his command, to steam north at 25 knots. He sent a message to Kinkaid at 7th Fleet, stating that the central force was heavily damaged according to strike reports, and that he was proceeding north with 3 groups to attack the carrier force at dawn. A critical miscommunication had occurred hours earlier. At 15:12 in the afternoon, Halsey had sent a preparatory message stating that Task Force 34, a surface action group of fast battleships and cruisers, would be formed if the situation required it. The message implied that this force would guard San Bernardino Strait against any Japanese attempt to transit it during the night. Kinkaid at 7th Fleet read that message and assumed Task Force 34 existed and was in position. Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor made the same assumption, but Halsey's clarifying voice message at 17:10 explaining that Task Force 34 would be formed only when he ordered it, and that he intended to take his battleships north with the carriers, never reached 7th Fleet due to radio range limitations. When Halsey steamed north, San Bernardino Strait was left completely unguarded. Not a single destroyer remained on picket duty. No submarines were stationed to give warning. The entire 3rd Fleet was racing north toward Ozawa's bait, leaving the back door to Leyte Gulf wide open. Beginning around midnight on October 25, Kurita's battered but still formidable center force passed through San Bernardino Strait unopposed. The great battleships Yamato and Nagato, the surviving heavy cruisers, the escorts that had weathered a day of American air attacks, all slipped through the undefended passage in single file. By 3 in the morning, Kurita's ships had emerged on the Pacific side and were steaming south toward Leyte Gulf. Ozawa's trap had worked exactly as intended. The sacrifice was unfolding according to plan. Dawn on October 25 brought the first American aircraft over the northern force. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's task force, 38 launched 527 sorties against Ozawa's ships throughout the day in 5 major strikes. The Japanese had no air cover. Their few remaining aircraft had either been shot down during the previous day's attack or had landed at Philippine airfields. The carriers were naked. The first strike arrived between 8:30 and 8:55 in the morning. Zuikaku took 3 bomb hits and 1 torpedo. The great carrier shuddered from the impacts. Flooding spread through her compartments, and she developed a sharp list to port. Skilled damage control teams fought back, counter-flooding compartments and shifting weight to bring her back toward even keel. But Zuikaku was badly hurt. The light carrier Chitose suffered fatal damage in this first attack. Torpedoes flooded her boiler rooms. Without power, she could not pump out the incoming water. Her list steepened inexorably. At 9:37 in the morning, Chitose capsized and sank. Captain Kishi Yoshiyuki chose to go down with his ship. Over 900 of his crew died with him. The second strike arrived just before 10 in the morning and concentrated on Chiyoda. A 500-pound bomb struck her squarely amidships. Near misses opened her hull to the sea. Flooding killed her starboard engine room. By 10:16, Chiyoda was dead in the water, unable to maneuver or escape. Ozawa recognized that Zuikaku could not survive much longer. Between 10:32 and 1100 hours, he transferred his flag to the light cruiser Oyodo. The transfer had to be conducted by small boats since Zuikaku's aircraft elevators were wrecked and her communications equipment had been destroyed. As Ozawa's launch pulled away from the carrier's side, her gunners were still firing at the circling American planes. The third strike sealed Zuikaku's fate. Between 13:08 and 13:25, 1:08 and 1:25 in the afternoon, American torpedo bombers executed what they called an anvil attack. They approached from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing the carrier to choose which torpedoes to avoid. She could not avoid them all. Zuikaku was struck by 6 torpedoes. 2 hit her starboard side. 4 hit her port side. 3 bombs added to the devastation. At 13:23, the 6th torpedo flooded her main steering compartment. Her rudder jammed. By 13:25, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force was dead in the water, listing 20 degrees to port, burning from stem to stern. At 13:27, Captain Toshikazu Omae ordered all hands to the flight deck. The wounded were brought up from below on stretchers and in the arms of their shipmates. At 13:58, with the list increasing to 23 degrees and the ship clearly dying, the order came to abandon ship. What happened next became one of the most iconic moments of the Pacific War. The crew gathered on the slanting flight deck, hundreds of men clinging to railings and aircraft tie-downs to keep from sliding into the sea. Captain Omai addressed them from the island structure. He announced that he intended to share the ship's fate. Then a bugler raised his instrument and played Kimigayo, the Japanese national anthem. As the anthem played, sailors lowered the naval ensign from the mast. This rising sun flag had flown over Zuikaku since her commissioning in 1941. It had flown during the attack on Pearl Harbor, the raid on Ceylon, the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of Santa Cruz, and the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Now it came down for the last time. The assembled crew raised their white caps toward the descending flag and cheered in tribute to their ship and their nation. Their voices echoed across the water as their ship died beneath them. At 2:14 in the afternoon, Zuikaku rolled over to port and sank stern first. Her position was recorded as 19 degrees 20 minutes north latitude, 125 degrees 15 minutes east longitude. 843 men went down with her, including Rear Admiral Kaizuka Takeo, who had been promoted to that rank just 10 days earlier. 862 survivors were pulled from the water by the destroyers Wakatsuki and Kuwa. The destruction continued through the afternoon. Zuiho, set ablaze during the third strike, was finished off by the fourth attack in late afternoon. She went down with heavy loss of life. Chiyoda, immobilized since morning, was sunk by gunfire from American cruisers under Rear Admiral Lawrence Dubose. The American warships approached the helpless carrier and poured shells into her at point-blank range. She went down at approximately 1700 hours with her entire crew of over 1,400 men. The American ships made no attempt to rescue survivors. The destroyer Hatsuzuki fought a gallant rearguard action to cover rescue operations for survivors of the carriers. She engaged Dubose's cruisers alone, her guns blazing defiance against overwhelming odds. She was sunk at 20:59, 8:59 in the evening. The light cruiser Tama, damaged earlier in the day and struggling northward, was found by the American submarine Jalao. A spread of torpedoes sent her to the bottom at 23:10, 11:10 at night. All hands were lost. Ozawa escaped northward with the hybrid battleships Issei and Hyuga, the cruiser Oyodo, and the surviving destroyers. He had accomplished exactly what he set out to do. His carriers had drawn Halsey's entire Third Fleet over 300 miles to the north. San Bernardino Strait had been left unguarded through the critical nighttime hours. Kurita's battleships had passed through unopposed and were now approaching Leyte Gulf. The sacrifice had been accepted, the opportunity had been created, but the opportunity was wasted. While Halsey hunted Ozawa's carriers, Kurita's center force stumbled into a battle no one had planned. Just after dawn on October 25, Japanese lookouts spotted masts on the horizon southeast of their position. Kurita's ships had found a group of American escort carriers designated Taffy 3. These were not the fleet carriers Kurita believed he was facing. Escort carriers were converted merchant ships, slow and lightly constructed, designed for anti-submarine patrols and close air support missions. They could carry only about 27 aircraft each. Their maximum speed was 19 knots, barely half what a Japanese destroyer could make. They had minimal armor to speak of. They were never intended to fight surface warships. At 6:58 in the morning, the super battleship Yamato opened fire. The largest naval guns in the world hurled shells at ships that could not possibly survive their impact. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded Taffy 3. He had 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. His ships were running for their lives, while Yamato's 18-inch shells straddled those, sending up geysers of dyed water to mark the fall of shot. Each splash brought the Japanese gunners closer to the range. What followed was one of the most extraordinary naval actions in history. Commander Ernest Evans of the destroyer Johnston did not wait for orders. He rang up flank speed and charged directly at the Japanese fleet. Evans was of Native American heritage. What is beyond dispute is his courage. He closed to 10,000 yards and launched all 10 of his torpedoes at the enemy line. His 5-inch guns pumped 200 rounds into the Japanese cruisers, starting fires and knocking out gun mounts. One of his torpedoes struck the heavy cruiser Kumano and blew her bow completely off. Japanese shells found Johnston repeatedly. Evans lost 2 fingers on his left hand. Shrapnel wounds covered his body. He moved his command station to the stern when the bridge was wrecked and kept fighting. For over 2 hours, Johnston traded fire with battleships and cruisers, a terrier snapping at wolves. She finally sank at 10:10 in the morning. Evans was last seen in a life raft by survivors. He was never found. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts was never designed for surface combat. She displaced 1,350 tons standard. Her armament was intended for shore bombardment and submarine hunting, but her crew took her into battle against battleships. Gunner's mate, 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, commanded the aft 5-inch gun mount. During the engagement, a defective shell exploded in the breach while being loaded. The blast killed or wounded most of his gun crew. Carr himself suffered mortal wounds, his abdomen torn open by the explosion. He was found dying at his station, holding the final shell in his arms, begging someone to help him load it so he could fire one more round. His gun crew had fired over 300 rounds in under 40 minutes. Samuel B. Roberts sank at 10:07 in the morning. She now rests at a depth of over 22,000 feet, the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed. Against all reason and logic, Taffy 3's desperate resistance worked. The smoke screens laid by the destroyers confused Japanese gunners. The constant air attacks from all 3 Taffy groups forced Kurita's ships to maneuver defensively. The suicidal torpedo runs by destroyers and destroyer escorts disrupted Japanese formations and damaged several cruisers. Most importantly, the ferocity of the American defense convinced Kurita that he faced a far more powerful force than actually existed. He believed the slow escort carriers were fast fleet carriers. He thought the small destroyers were cruisers. His staff could not explain why American ships would charge his battleships unless they were buying time for a major fleet action. At 9:11 in the morning, Kurita ordered his fleet to turn north and withdraw. He signaled all ships with 3 words, "My course north." The most powerful surface force Japan had ever assembled for a single operation sailed away from a target it could have annihilated. The transports in Leyte Gulf, the prize that justified every ship and every man Ozawa had sacrificed, remained untouched. Kurita later offered various explanations for his decision. He claimed he was searching for a reported American carrier force to the north. He argued that his fleet was too scattered and disorganized after the morning's chaotic action to continue the attack effectively. He calculated that even if he reached the transports, American aircraft from the escort carriers would sink his ships before he could escape. Whatever his true reasoning, the result was the same. He never reached Leyte Gulf. The sacrifice of Ozawa's carriers had created the opportunity. Kurita threw it away. Taffy 3 paid a terrible price for their stand. The escort carrier Gambier Bay became the only American carrier in history sunk by surface gunfire. The escort carrier St. Lo became the first major warship sunk by kamikaze attack when a suicide plane crashed through her flight deck later that morning. The destroyers Johnston and Hole went down fighting. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts joined them on the bottom. Over 1,000 American sailors died, but the invasion fleet survived. The transports unloaded their troops and supplies. The beachhead held. The liberation of the Philippines continued. Ozawa had done everything asked of him. He had volunteered his carriers as bait. He had sailed them into the path of the American fleet. He had drawn Halsey north, opening San Bernardino Strait. He had lost 4 carriers, a cruiser, and 2 destroyers. Thousands of his men had died, many of them in the waters off Cape Engano, others on the ships that limped away from the battle only to be hunted down later. In his post-war interrogation, Ozawa reflected on what had happened. "The chief concern was to lure your forces further north," he said. "We expected complete destruction." He paused, then continued. "I thought if Kurita's fleet ever succeeded in attacking your landing forces, I would be satisfied, even though totally destroyed. If they destroyed the transports there in Leyte Gulf, I would have been satisfied. They did not destroy the transports. The carriers died for nothing." Ozawa reportedly contemplated suicide after the battle. A fellow officer dissuaded him with the observation that Ozawa was the only Japanese admiral at Leyte Gulf who had successfully accomplished his assigned mission. Kurita had retreated. Nishimura had been annihilated at Sho Go Strait. Shima had fled without engaging. Only Ozawa had done exactly what the plan required. It was cold comfort. The Imperial Japanese Navy never recovered from Leyte Gulf. The battle cost Japan 26 to 28 warships, including 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, and 10 cruisers. Over 300,000 tons of combatant shipping went to the bottom. More than 10,000 Japanese sailors perished. The combined fleet ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The carriers that survived Leyte Gulf never sorted again. There were no pilots left to fly from their decks. The battleships that remained afloat became floating anti-aircraft batteries, tied to piers in the inland sea, waiting for the American bombers that would eventually sink them at anchor. Ozawa survived the war. After the Northern Force was disbanded on November 15, 1944, he became Vice Chief of the Naval General Staff. In this position, he was involved in planning Operation Tengo, the suicide mission that sent the super battleship Yamato and her escorts to their deaths off Okinawa in April 1945. On May 29, 1945, Ozawa became the last commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, succeeding Admiral Toyoda in a position that now commanded a fleet that existed largely on paper. Ozawa was the only wartime holder of that supreme command who was not promoted to full admiral. He reportedly refused the promotion, perhaps believing he did not deserve it, perhaps recognizing that rank meant nothing when the fleet was gone. American intelligence officers interrogated Ozawa on October 30, 1945, in occupied Tokyo. They found him cooperative and remarkably candid, willing to discuss in detail the operations that had destroyed the force he commanded. He answered questions about tactics, logistics, and command decisions with the precision of a professional officer who took his craft seriously even in defeat. Near the end of the interview, Ozawa offered a final assessment of the war he had fought. "It is my opinion," he said simply, "that this war should never have taken place." He spent his remaining years quietly. From 1955 until his health declined, he served as an advisor to the Japanese Defense Agency, helping to build the new maritime self-defense force on the ruins of the Imperial Navy. Photographs from this period show an old man in civilian clothes, still towering over his countrymen, the harsh features of the gargoyle softened by age and the weight of memory. He died on November 9, 1966, at the age of 80. History has not been kind to Ozawa's memory. The battle off Cape Engano is rarely discussed except as a footnote to the greater controversies of Leyte Gulf. When historians debate the battle, They argue about Halsey's decision to chase the carriers north. They criticize Kurita's retreat at the moment of victory. They celebrate the heroism of Taffy 3. They analyze the communications failures that left San Bernardino Strait unguarded. They seldom remember the man who made it all possible, the admiral who volunteered to die so that others might have a chance. Ozawa understood something that his contemporaries and many historians have failed to grasp. By October 1944, Japan had already lost the war. The question was not whether Japan would be defeated, but how that defeat would unfold. Sho Go One was not a plan for victory. It was a desperate gamble to inflict enough damage on the American invasion that perhaps, somehow, the terms of Japan's inevitable surrender might be slightly less catastrophic. Ozawa accepted his role in that gamble with clear eyes. He knew his carriers were useless as fighting ships. He knew his pilots were not capable of effective strikes. He knew that sailing south meant death for his ships and most of his men. He volunteered anyway because the alternative was to sit in port and wait for the end. The Zuikaku rests today on the floor of the Philippine Sea, the last of the carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor. Her wreck lies in darkness at a depth that human divers cannot reach. With her lie the remains of the men who lowered her flag and cheered as she rolled over. They died for a plan that worked exactly as designed and failed anyway. That is perhaps the cruelest lesson of Ozawa's final mission. Sometimes doing everything right is not enough. Sometimes the bravest sacrifice, the most skillful execution, the most carefully laid plans all lead nowhere. Sometimes you can give everything you have and watch it all slip away through no fault of your own. Jisaburo Ozawa knew this when he raised his hand to volunteer. He knew it when he sailed south from Japan with his empty carriers. He knew it when he stood on the deck of the cruiser Oyodo and watched Zuikaku sink. He had done his duty. He had given his men's lives for a chance at victory. The chance was squandered by others. But the sacrifice endures in the historical record, a testament to what men will do when they believe their cause requires it. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We work to bring you these lesser-known stories from World War II, accounts that deserve to be remembered even when they end in tragedy. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, united by an interest in the history that shaped our world. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering the men who gave everything, even when everything was not enough.